It's really nice to have everybody here, and you know, I should have guest speakers more often. She's a lot prettier than I am, so that makes it, you know. So, but I think that's why people said they just want to see who the other speaker was. No, but honestly, you know, I really appreciate you guys being here and taking the effort to learn about what you can do for your body. Dawn works at Sharing Yoga downtown Concord, and anybody that I've ever known that has gone to see or done classes with her just speaks very, very highly of her. They have very, very good things to say about her. So without further ado, I don't want to take away from her thunder, but if you know of anybody that is interested in yoga, or if anybody's interested in getting checked or anything like that, my hope is that you open your mouth and say something to somebody, because it's really important that this practice not only is for here, but it's for the community. That's why I try to bring in guest speakers periodically, so you guys can learn other avenues of help. So, without further ado, let's do it.
Thank you. So, have any of you done yoga before? I just need to know like a little bit about this. Okay. So we have some people who have a little bit of background with yoga. So, just a couple of questions before I start. Anybody want to talk about what brought you here, or what made you interested in yoga specifically, the workshop, or has there been a little spark of interest before and you just thought, oh, come and check it out a little bit? Yeah, a little bit. So, I know, I don't like to talk when I'm out there either. I like to hide. I usually sit back. So it's a workshop about yoga and stretching. So both have benefits. There's a lot of stretching in yoga. Yoga isn't just about stretching, it's strengthening and a lot of other things that I'll talk about too. But one of the things that distinguishes yoga from just stretching, when we're stretching in yoga, is the breath and just being aware and having a specific space set aside just for yoga or stretching. And having somebody guide you through it potentially, whether it's at home in a DVD or you're in a class or wherever your environment is that you're comfortable. Whereas if you're just stretching, I know a lot of people tend to, oh, I'm going to go for a run, I'm going to stretch just for a couple of minutes, and that's not bad. It's a good thing. The more stretching, the better. But when you carve out an hour and a half time, it's much more complete, and you can work with strength and stretching at the same time. I thought about a lot of these misconceptions people have coming into yoga. Some of them might not be entirely misconceptions because there are people out there who practice spiritual meditation practices, and they do these crazy postures. We've all probably seen pictures of them or seen them online. But the reality is that most people that's not yoga for most people. Your average person is coming in, they're recovering from an injury, or they're just tight, or they just want to improve their health, or their doctor told them to come because they had some kind of injury, or they're stressed out. So there are a lot of different things that bring people to yoga to start. Sometimes it's just curiosity. A couple of years ago, we had some hockey players from Manchester coming in, and they were all the goalies, and they wanted to stretch like the hips and everything so that they could do their splits for. So there's all different kinds. You care about yoga. People practicing yoga who are athletes, who are playing basketball or football, because it helps to prevent injury. Because when muscles get tight, then they become more prone to injury. So a lot of times, if somebody is doing repetitive movements over a bunch of years, whether it's athletics or something else that they're doing, that tends to be sometimes the part of the body that becomes injured, and it's because that's the part of the body that has become tight because it hasn't been stretched out. It's been worked. There are imbalances in the body that creep in over time, and yoga can address those things, and stretching can too. But it doesn't have to be mystical. You don't have to do mantras. You don't have to use essential oils. You can use essential oils, but you don't have to. And you can just start. You take a step. You go into a class, or you take a yoga 101 or a beginner yoga or something like that, or a gentle class, and it just kind of gives you a little bit of insight. Like, is this for me or is it not for me? So yoga and stretching both improve flexibility. Dr. Sandra,
I was just going to ask. So the other day I had somebody come in and they said yoga, mostly women do that, right? So if I'm hearing correctly, it's not just about that. A lot of the athletes and other people are doing that. Have you noticed that in your classes?
Yes,
that more men
so.
are starting to come in with
Absolutely.
that? Okay.
I think it makes a difference for the particular studio that I work at that it's owned by a man. And so, you know, you go onto the website and he's there and he's, you know, he's in his 50s, just like a normal average guy. He's not like this, you know, crazy yogi person with his foot behind his head or anything like that. So I think it makes people feel comfortable, like, oh, you know, this is a normal guy, and so I can go and, you know, I can do yoga too. He's very good, and he has taught me over the years. I've worked with David for 10 or 12 years now. And he's taught me how to help men specifically, because he has this experience where he, you know, he came into yoga, I think in his early 40s, early 30s, and he was a little bit overweight, he was really stiff, he was tight, he didn't have a healthy lifestyle before that, he was, you know, had done a lot of drinking and partying during his, you know, younger years. And so when he discovered yoga, it was like an awakening kind of thing. You know, he realized, like, oh, I can do this. You know, it's not something that's just for women. It's for everybody. And men, they just have tightness in different areas of the body than women in general. Men tend to have more upper body strength. And so sometimes it's the shoulders that are tight or the hips. I have men all the time say, oh, you know, my hips are tight. Can you do hip opening stuff? I have a couple of people men that come in who do golf a lot. And so they kind of started practicing yoga just for their golf game, but then it became more than that. It became yoga just for yoga because it's so helpful and beneficial overall. So thank you for that question. A few weeks ago, I teach on a Wednesday night at 5:30 class, and there were actually more men in the room than women. And somebody made the comment, and I looked around, and there were more men than women. So it was an interesting sort of thing that happened, but not usually. There are usually more women than men. So tight muscles are shortened muscles. So if you're working your muscles out, or just over time, the muscles can become short. And when you have a muscle, there's on either end there's an attachment to a bone, and it's a connective tissue. There's either, you know, tendons or ligaments, and so when a muscle starts to tighten and it starts to shorten, and it starts to pull on those areas. And, you know, they're all over our body, obviously. But when you start to pull on something, it can start to create a little bit of an imbalance, and it can start to have this sort of domino effect on other areas. So sometimes, you know, one area of say, somebody's IT band, this is band that runs on the outside of the thigh from the hip down into the outside of the knee. And if that becomes tight, that can start to pull on the knee. There's some seats over here if you want to come over. It can start to pull on the knee, and a lot of people who have knee pain and knee injuries find out that it's really coming from or originating from that tightness through their IT band. And if you do cycling or you know, any kind of athletic stuff, that area of the body can get tight. Hiking, those kind of things. One of the things that's important too before you stretch is to keep the muscles warm. I think most of us have probably heard that or read it somewhere throughout time, and it really is important because if the muscles are cold, or if the body is cold and you stretch, then, you know, muscles contract with the cold, and so it can, you know, create an environment for injury, especially if you're not, you know, really paying attention to how you're holding your body. How you hold your body is really important when you stretch too. Where you have your weight, where you have your hips positioned, how you have your foot in relation to your knee. There's so many different things, so it's really important to be educated in how to stretch before you stretch extensively. One thing about the breath too is that through yoga you start to become more aware of how you're breathing and how the breath will reflect tension. If you're holding tension in your body, if you stretch, a lot of times you'll realize that you're holding your breath. And so we use the breath as an awareness thing to show us where we are with the posture. So if you're breathing and you're paying attention to the breath and you're not just holding your breath, you'll notice a change, and the body will start to give a little bit, the muscles will start to loosen up a little bit, and the intensity of the stretch will start to loosen a little bit. Inflexibility in muscles and connective tissue contributes over time to poor posture. So if you're here and you're being adjusted, this is one of those things that you can do to help kind of maintain those adjustments that Dr. Sam is giving. And it can definitely complement the practice. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Later we talked about injury prevention. Whether it's from repetitive movements or weightlifting or an active lifestyle or stress, the disease doesn't stay isolated in one area. If it's addressed and you realize it's there and you start to stretch, then you can kind of work through it. But usually travels. You know, it starts in one area and then it starts to affect other areas in the body. We talked a little bit about athletics and how can be beneficial to anything that you're doing athletically. I heard a gentleman come in when he was doing the cycling race that they do in France.
Tour de France.
Thank you. He was doing the Tour de France, and that's how he started yoga, because he learned, or he realized, or he wanted to find out if it would be helpful. And so he said that was one of the best years that he had, because he had been practicing yoga consistently. He didn't just come in the week before and do a little bit of yoga, like he built up to it. And he said it helped him. And one thing about yoga too, or stretching, once you know how to do it, then you can do it on your own, and you can use it. You don't necessarily have to come to a class just for that. You can use it on your own if you're traveling or doing Tour de France.
So you were talking about the breath and the awareness that goes with that. Does that awareness also come into play when you are doing other activities? Like, does it help you become aware of, like, what's going on in your body when you're doing other activities? It's just a question that I have, because if you're
Very
becoming
much
more
so.
aware, yeah. And I mean, does it help with that also?
It does, and I had it actually in my notes about how it teaches self-awareness, and the breath is part of that. A lot of things, like the breath, we carry over into other areas of our lives, because a lot of times, before we come into this awareness of how we're breathing, we don't realize that there are imbalances in the breath. Just like there are imbalances in the body, the breath can have imbalances in it too. And it can show up as, maybe you're breathing in really short inhales, or really short exhales. One tends to be longer than the other, and your yoga practice helps you to be aware of how you're breathing, and it teaches you how to breathe in a more beneficial way. Sometimes people breathe way up in their chest, especially if they've been through areas of trauma or constant stress in their lives. Breathing way up high in the chest it comes from stress, but then it also exacerbates stress over time. Breathing that way, so it helps to kind of shift the way that you're breathing. It's very subtle, and it doesn't have to be fancy or complicated or anything. It just increases your awareness, basically, and it teaches you what those imbalances are and how you're breathing. Sometimes people breathe way down in their belly, and they're sometimes referred to by doctors and other people as belly breathers. The breath is way down here. And that isn't necessarily a detrimental thing, but again, if you can it can create like weakness through the lower abdominal area if you're constantly breathing that way. And so basically it's an intention thing. You want to be intentional with how you're breathing. If you're breathing in the belly and you want to create an effect with the breath, breathing in the belly can have a very relaxing effect, which makes sense, because if you're breathing up here, it's creating stress, or caused by stress, or both. But if you're breathing in the belly, it can relax. So thank you for that, Dr. Sam. The breath is really important. It carries oxygen to places. It carries the breath. The breath encourages things to move in the body, and when we're slouching forward, the breath can become restricted. The shoulders are rounding forward. A lot of times we're holding devices in our hands, or we're sitting a lot, or we're at computers, and the shoulders are rounding forward. And what happens is the upper back and the muscles in the shoulders become overstretched in some areas, and then the muscles at the front of the body become short, and then they become weak. So it's this sort of double negative, if you will, that happens in the body. So the postures that we teach in yoga help to create awareness of that. They help to create awareness of how we're holding ourselves, and a lot of postures that we do, like in back bending postures, where you're arching the back, even if it's just in a subtle back bend, and there's all different back bends. It doesn't mean that you're in a full bow and you're up on your hands and your feet necessarily, and you can build up to that. There are all different postures in yoga that can meet your body where you're at. If I'm teaching one posture in class, and there's a person who has a limitation with back bends, I go over to them and offer them a different modification or something that they're able to access that can be comfortable for them. There's a lot to it. So strength is another thing. If we're just stretching all the time, then what happens is we tend to start to overstretch, and that can have a detrimental effect as well. If you're constantly stretching and you're not strengthening those areas that tend to be already flexible or open in the body, then that can create an environment for injury as well, because there's no strength there to support it. So it's important to build strength, and yoga can do that. Stretching obviously is a different thing, but yoga can strengthen. There's a lot of standing postures in yoga that you can do that strengthen the lower body. There's core building strength. postures, both the front and the back. A lot of people will focus on the abdominal muscles and strengthening the front of your core, front of the core, but it's also important to keep the back of the core strong as well. What you do with one part, you want one side of the body, whether it's the front of the body or the back of the body, you want to make sure you do together so that there's balance in the body. And strengthening the back muscles and the abdominals both help to support the spine and posture overall, because this is the center of your body, is kind of where everything moves away from or from. It creates a lot of stability to have strength in both sides of the core. There's push-ups, arm balances, and all of those things help to create abdominal upper body strength. Yoga twisting. So yoga twisting is one of those things that is kind of unique to yoga, not entirely, but it's yoga twisting, or any kind of twisting that you're doing with the upper body, is really beneficial for a number of reasons. It helps to keep mobility in the torso, and the torso is one of those areas where we don't move a lot. We're always moving our arms and our legs, but how do we move with the torso, and how do we? Usually it's forward bending. Sometimes it's back bending, but usually it's forward bending that we're doing. And when we're twisting, we take the time out to twist, and we stay there, and we breathe in the twist. That helps to keep pliability and flexibility and muscles around the spine. It helps to counter things that you're doing, like forward bending or back bending. If you're working the abdominals, twisting can be a really nice way to kind of counter some of that and bring the body back into a balanced place. There are twists that help to open up the hips. There are twists that help to open up the shoulders. And one of the nice things about twist is that it encourages the exchange of nutrients in the spine, which Dr. Sam talks about in a couple of his workshops. He talks about this exchange and how the muscles around the spine help to encourage that exchange and keep things moving in there. Let's see. The forward bending helps to stretch the legs, the backs of the legs and the hips and the back and the neck. So those areas get tight, right? Just walking around or running or everything that we're doing in life, especially in our culture, we're sitting a lot. And so the backs of the legs get tight, the hamstrings get tight, the calves get tight, and to stretch those things out. And those things travel too. Like if you have tightness in your hamstrings, that can travel up into the lower back. A lot of people come into yoga and they say, oh, I have my lower back pain, my lower back hurts. And sometimes talking to people, there has been an injury, or there is an actual potentially a subluxation in the spine, or something that they're dealing with that isn't necessarily muscle related. But if it's purely muscle related, what happens is when you have tightness in the hamstrings or in the hips at all, that can start to pull on the lower back. There are some of these muscles that attach to the spine and the lower back. So it's important to keep those things pliable and stretching and stretched out. We work with seated postures on the floor, and those postures address. That's where we build a lot of flexibility. So a lot of yoga classes are, they'll start with like a couple of seated poses, maybe a twist, maybe a couple of things on the hands and knees, and then we start to get into the standing poses. And standing poses build strength in the lower body, but they also build heat in the body. And then when we come to seated afterwards, the body is warmed, and now it's ready to come a little bit deeper into the stretching part of the practice. And so the body has been prepared for the stretches through those previous postures that we've done. And depending on what seated postures we're working with, we can work with stretching the legs, the hips, the shoulders, the side body, and around the spine. The side body is one of those areas that we don't just stretch out naturally. We don't just do this in our daily lives unless we practice yoga, like Heather over here, who practices yoga a lot. We talked the other day, she's like, somebody will come into the kitchen and I'll have my leg like up on the counter, and they'll be like, what are you doing? I'm just doing yoga. And that's one of the things that happens with yoga. When you've started practicing yoga and you've been practicing for a little bit of time, the body will start to ask for it. And your body will just you find yourself kind of moving around a little bit differently and coming into, even just sitting on airplanes, things like that. And you'll also feel your body start to stiffen up. Whereas before, you might just feel a general sense of like, oh, I don't feel very good, I feel tired, I feel fatigued, jet lag and those kind of things. And yoga can help to counter all of those things. When I'm on an airplane, I'm always moving around, I'm always twisting, I'm taking my arms above my head. People probably look at me like, what is she doing? But it's very healthy for the body because it encourages the body to, the blood flow to keep moving through, and it keeps you stretched out.
So I have two quick questions. Do you find, like you were talking about the different ranges of motion, okay? And that's something we always talk about. Do you find specific ranges of motion that are usually more restricted in people than not? Like you were talking about bending sideways and forward and back. Do you find that you have to work harder with some people with certain ranges of motion more so than others?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what would those be, out of curiosity?
A lot of people say shoulders. You know, they want to do, when they say shoulders, usually they mean like chest opening and front of the shoulder opening. And there's a number of different postures that can address that. Some are a little bit more gentle, some are deeper. Try to build to those things. So usually at the beginning of class, I'll say, does anybody have any requests, any part of the body that you want to work on, any favorite posture that you want to do? And if somebody says, I need to work on the shoulders, then I'll try to create a sequence that will build to that so that they're not coming into a really deep chest and shoulder opener right off the bat. They just kind of build up to over throughout the class. But the shoulders and the hips, people always say hips and shoulders. And the hips are kind of an interesting thing because, what we perceive to be as tightness in the hips isn't necessarily just from the hips. It comes back to like the hamstrings, even the calf muscles, the upper body. There's so many different things. The abdominals even can make it feel like there's a lot of tightness because there are these muscles that run along the front of the hip called the hip flexors. And so if there's tightness in the abdominals, it can start to pull on the hip flexors and it makes it feel like the tightness is in the hip. And it's really coming from the abdominal muscles. Or vice versa. Sometimes there is tightness in hip flexors, especially people who walk a lot, run a lot, sit a lot, pretty much everybody in this room. This gets tight, like the front of the hips get tight, and lunges and different postures that we do in yoga can help to address that. And again, if somebody comes in and they say, can you work with hips, I kind of build toward that. But there's also other parts of the hip. There's also like the hip joint in itself, and there's also, the outside of the hip, and there's the back of the hip, there's the glutes. So somebody says hips, I try to, unless I know the person already and I know what part of the hip they want to work with, I try to figure that out, and again, build toward it. And you may notice that if you go to a yoga class, you'll see how a teacher will build towards something and they'll build up to something so that you're not just all of a sudden in this crazy pose. Even the people that you see in these pictures who they have their head put behind their head, or they're in a crazy back bend or something, they've probably done it, practice that before the picture was taken to warm up to that. They don't just come into it cold turkey, hopefully. Yes.
Holding poses. I've done a couple different classes, and Bikram yoga, I've been to that a few times. And is there a set amount of time? Because sometimes we'll hold a pose for 3 or 4 seconds, and then sometimes we'll hold in a pose for 12 to 15 seconds.
Yeah, that's a good question. It really, some people need a lot of movement, and their breath moves a little faster, and they're just, I don't know if the word constitution is different, but they just need something different than other people. Benefit more from holding the posture longer periods of time. Ashtanga yoga, which is loosely where my background is based on, the general standard is 3 to 5 breaths. So again, people breathe at different rates, but it's like 30 to 60 seconds. And it really depends on the posture. There are also sun salutations and warm-up poses where you're not necessarily going to hold the posture. You're going to be moving with the breath. So your inhale might bring you into like a back bend, and your exhale might bring you into something where the back is more rounded. And so you're moving with each inhale and each exhale. And those things are good for building warmth, and they do create awareness of the breath, because if you're really focusing on connecting your movement with your breath, then it just creates a deeper sense of how you're breathing. And it will also kind of root out imbalances in the breath, as you're paying attention to those things. But that's a good question. There's also different types of yoga that specifically hold postures for longer periods of time. Can't think of the name of it, but there was
Yin yoga.
Thank you. That's exactly it. Yin yoga. You look like you're pained by the thought.
5 minutes you hold this pose.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So there are a lot fewer postures in a class.
Yeah.
You did that too?
Well, that's where the breathing comes in. Is it
Right.
the longer it goes, for me anyway, the more locked in I get.
Yes. Yeah, so if you're holding your breath, you're all of a sudden, you're going to be real, like, I need to breathe. So, if you have an instructor who's guiding you through, they're going to cue you to those things. They're going to, remember to breathe and focus on the breath and make the breath longer and all of those kind of, things that we say. But you're right, when you're in a posture and you're there and you can feel the tension starting to creep back in, which is kind of, counterproductive to what you're trying to accomplish, it does bring your awareness back to the breath, because you have to, and that's one of the times when you can really feel the effects of the breath too, because when you're holding your breath, it creates tension. Sometimes it's caused by tension, but then it creates tension too. And then when you start to breathe, you can feel the muscles start to give a little bit. And you can feel the change start to happen. And I've had people say, when I'm in a posture, if I have my leg out in front of me and I'm in a forward bend, and there's a lot of tightness in that, the back of the leg, when I start to breathe after I take 3 or 4 breaths, I can feel like the stretch start to ease a little bit. Should I stay there, or should I come a little bit deeper? And usually the general advice is you can move a little bit deeper with your exhale. In your next exhale, you come a little bit deeper into the pose, which may mean in a forward bend that you bring your upper body forward a little bit more. So, a good question about the amount of time.
No, you were talking about the different techniques, because I know, my understanding of Ashtanga is that it's more of a strength-based technique, and Vinyasa is more flowing. Is that correct? I don't know.
Ashtanga does have vinyasa in it. That's where
Okay.
sun salutations come into play.
Okay.
I can see why the Ashtanga would have that perception of being strength-based, because there are a lot of strengthening postures in it, and there's a lot of arm balances. But there's also a lot of stretching. There's a lot of forward bending.
Okay.
But there's also what we call vinyasa in between. So if you're seated and you're in a forward bend, a vinyasa would mean that you come into a high plank pose, you lower down, do a little push-up, and you come into a back bend, and then back to downward dog, which is sort of an inverted V. And then you come through that downward dog to seated again. And you do that potentially in between sides. So you do a forward bend over one leg, you do the vinyasa, you do the forward bend over the other leg, and then you do the vinyasa. And the vinyasa does create a lot of strength, especially in the upper body. Did you have a question?
I did. If you're in a pose and you're stretching and you breathe, like you said a few times, and you exhale again and you're going deeper into the stretch, how do you know how far to go without hurting yourself?
That's a good question.
It doesn't hurt. That it hurts.
Pain.
So how do you know how far to go?
That's a very good question. One of the things that can throw that off, and this is a little bit of sidebar, is if you're on non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication like Advil or anything like that, because it can mask the signals that your body is giving you. If somebody's really flexible, they may tend to overstretch a little bit because maybe their knee has hyperextended or something like that. But those things teach us. It's through those minor little injuries sometimes that we learn what our limitations are. But your body will meet that point of resistance. And once you feel your body meet that point of resistance, then you have to stop there and breathe. But it's a learning process. That whole self-awareness thing, and that's part of it, is figuring out where your body is at, and where your limitations are, and where your sort of point of resistance is in the different postures. And if you're with an instructor who's being, watching you and careful with you, what happens is, using a forward bend, a seated forward bend for an example, if your back is rounded a lot and you're in a seated forward bend and you're pulling on your foot, that's gonna cause an injury. So that's where the instructor comes in, and maybe looking around you at what different people are doing who have been practicing yoga for a longer time, and they got to know how to hold the body. Your back should be more long and kind of more upright potentially. When you're rounded in a forward bend, you should never pull on the foot, because that can cause strain to the back.
And that's where I guess a class would help, because I've tried to do yoga at home by myself, and nobody's there to say, you're breathing wrong, and you're holding your body wrong, and, you can hurt yourself.
Yes, you can hurt yourself. And you can hurt yourself in a class, with an instructor as well, but you have somebody who's going to be there to observe you and even have a conversation with you before class. And it's always good to practice first when you're doing something new under an instructor, under somebody who is knowledgeable, even if it's a friend who has been practicing for years and they've picked up all of these things that may just feel like second nature to them, but really they learned it somewhere. But you're right, it's important to keep yourself safe. The first thing that I ask people when they come is, have you been here before? But then the second question is, do you have any injuries? And it helps me to maybe give them some upfront advice of things to be wary of and to be aware of. I can't believe it's 7 o'clock.
Yeah, well, so do you find that, like, not just athletes, but a lot of people will let their ego get into it, and then they say, I can do this.
Oh yeah, I'm going
type
to
of
power
thing.
through.
Okay, I'm going to
And
power
you
through,
can-
and that's when the injuries happen.
Seriously.
Yeah, they're not listening to what's going on or feeling what's going on.
And that's our culture. That's our culture. It's no pain, no gain. It's competitive. It's like looking at the person next to me. Like, if I tried to do some of the stuff Heather does, I would be hurt. But you know, and everybody is coming from a different place, and that's one of the things that I had at the end that I want to touch on is that, you know, anybody can do yoga. If anybody who can seek out yoga can find a yoga that's appropriate for them. Whether it's a beginner yoga class or an advanced yoga class or, you know, chair yoga. There's chair yoga for people who have severe limitations, who have maybe elderly or just have had, you know, gone through a traumatic time or injury or anything like that. You can do, you know, private sessions where somebody is really, really focused on you and just watching everything that you're doing and, you know, talking you through little by little. But it is deeply beneficial, and one of the things that happens over time too is I hear so many people come into class and they're like, oh, I did yoga tonight. You know, and they've just come from work and they've come from a stressful situation, and more doctors recommend yoga for stress and recovering from injury. I had a gentleman come in, another golfer, who tore his pectoral, thank you, and had the surgery, and then after a certain amount of time, PT and all of that, the doctor said, you should think about stretching, maybe a yoga class. And now, you know, he does yoga regularly. And, you know, I'll walk into the room and he's already there on the wall, you know, stretching out, because some of the postures that are in a class, he can't necessarily do to the full extent. He has to modify for them. But, you know, knowing he has that injury helps the instructor to know how to help.
Just having been in your class and having been in other yoga classes, for everybody in this room, and I find it a lot at sharing yoga, that there's such a variety of people.
Instructors or people
Instructors
practicing?
and you know, people going, that from beginner to expert, and I've been at both ends of that I think that there are so many modifications, and that anybody can be comfortable in a class. And like this whole room right now could do a yoga class, and everybody would be comfortable, because you do take it to your limit.
Yes.
And you know your limit, and you mentioned how stretchy I am. Dr. Sam calls me Gumby. But I can overextend, and so I have to do almost the opposite of everybody else, because I can go too far.
Right.
And
my
so I
cues
need
for
to
you
bring
are
it
about
back.
keeping your hips level,
Yeah.
because you're going to overstretch and building strength, as opposed to maybe somebody next to you who just needs to like cue to get a little bit deeper into the stretch. And there's blocks, you know, we have blocks in yoga classes. Any yoga studio that you go to that I know of would have blocks, straps, you know, and those kind of things. They're not crutches. They're just there to like bridge the gap until you come a little bit deeper, to keep you safe, or to even bring you deeper into a posture. If you're, you know, I have people who come in like Heather and other people who are really flexible, and I'll come over to them and I'll look at what they're doing and I'll say, do you feel a stretch? And they're like, no, I don't feel anything at all. You know, and that's when I either cue them how to, you know, turn their hand differently, or bring them a block to put in front of their foot, because their hands can reach their foot, but then, you know, they need more, so to find a deeper stretch. So, but there's all levels. I mean, I have a gentleman who comes to my classes, almost 80 years old. I've had children in my classes, teenagers, young adults. Like, it's for everybody. So definitely anybody in this room, like Heather said, any of you could, you know, be comfortable in a yoga class. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Again, thank you very, very much for coming. Make sure you sign in. We do a raffle at the end of the month after the workshops. Again, Dawn is at Sharing Yoga. I don't know if you have any information with you.
We don't have anything.
You don't have anything. So they're right downtown, yes?
Yes,
They're right.
it's sharingyoga.com if you want to just go on and look.
You know,